My name is Emma Cole, and I'm 34 years old. 3 weeks after my wedding, on an ordinary Friday morning, my parents were watching the same national morning show they've watched for 20 years, Coffee at 7, my mother's ritual, when the host smiled into the camera and introduced the most beloved author in America that nobody had ever seen, and my husband walked out onto that stage under the studio lights. My mother turned around slowly. She had called my wedding embarrassing. She had stood up in the middle of the ceremony in front of everyone and walked out with my dad before the vows. But the broadcast isn't the story. What my mother did 3 weeks after that broadcast. The banner. The 200 guests. The toast she never got to give. That's the part I still can't quite believe. And what I did back, in front of the whole town she spent her life performing for, she will never forgive me for. This is where quiet people finally tell the stories their families hoped would stay buried, told slowly, honestly, the way they actually happened. If that's your kind of story, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. I teach 3rd grade in Maple Falls, the kind of New England town where the hardware store still sharpens skates and everybody's business is a public utility. I've spent 10 years learning how to stand calmly in front of 25 8-year-olds, which is excellent training for standing calmly in front of my mother. Here is the job I held before teaching, the one I was hired into at 6 years old. I was the manager of my family's image. Nobody called it that. It looked like little things. When my dad got laid off from the electrical contractor the winter I was 12, my mother sat me down and taught me the sentence I was to say at school. He's consulting now. I said it so well that I half believed it, even while I watched him do the crossword at 10 on a Tuesday morning with his jaw set like a man holding a door shut. I learned which family stories were tellable and which got rewritten in the car on the way to church. I learned to walk into St. Andrew's half a step behind my mother with my chin at the approved altitude. And I learned the sentence that ran our whole house, the one my mother first said to me outside those church doors when I was 6 years old and crying about something I don't even remember. She crouched down, fixed my collar, and said, "Smile, Emma. People are looking." Not, "It's okay." Not, "I've got you." Smile, people are looking. I got good at it. That's the part I have to be honest about because this story doesn't work if I lie to you. I was excellent at my job. I could smooth a scandal before it finished happening. And I hated how good I was, the way you hate a talent that was assigned to you instead of chosen. To understand my mother's kingdom, you have to understand that Maple Falls runs on visibility. Patricia Lewis has chaired the Women's Circle at St. Andrews for 19 years. She runs the Harvest Festival Committee the way small countries run their militaries. When someone in town has a surgery, a death, a disgrace, my mother arrives with a casserole, and the casserole is never just food. It's a census. She goes in with green bean bake and comes out with the full inventory of your kitchen, your marriage, and your odds. I want to be fair. Half the town genuinely loves her, and the half that doesn't returns her dishes washed and on time. In my mother's economy, success that can't be seen doesn't exist. A promotion is real when it's announced at coffee hour. A marriage is real when the right people danced at it. She has opinions about which families present well, and she has spent 40 years making absolutely certain the Lewises were one of them, with a discipline I'd call heroic if it hadn't been pointed at me. Her own childhood was a locked room. Her father, my grandfather, was never mentioned. Not once. Not at funerals. Not at holidays. I knew only that she'd grown up on Quarry Street, back when Quarry Street was the address that made cashiers count your change twice. Whatever happened there, she'd sealed it under 40 years of committee minutes and perfect hems. Ask my mother what love is, and she will answer you, without blinking, with a seating chart. So when her only daughter, the one she'd trained since 6 to manage the family's reflection, came home at 32 and said she was seeing the quiet man who worked mornings at the bookstore, my mother didn't ask if I was happy. She asked, and I quote her exactly, "What will I tell people?" Nathan Cole worked the morning shift at Fern and Feather Books on Main Street, and the first thing I ever watched him do was talk a furious 9-year-old out of quitting reading forever. The kid had been handed some joyless assigned novel. Nathan listened like the boy was a colleague with a grievance, then slid one paperback across the counter and said, "Don't trust me, test me." The kid came back a week later demanding the sequel. That was the whole man, right there. He was 35 then, quiet in a way that wasn't shy, quiet like a house with good bones. We dated slowly. He closed the store on Thursdays, and we'd eat chowder from the place by the depot, and he'd ask me questions no one had ever asked me, like what I'd loved before I was told what to love. 6 months in, on the porch of his little rented cottage, he told me the thing I am going to trust you with now. The thing that runs under every minute of this story. You've heard of C.J. Harlow. Everyone's heard of C.J. Harlow, the author of the Lanternfield books, the series in every classroom and every dentist's waiting room in America, the writer famous for never once showing his face. No author photo, no tours, no interviews, 9 years of guessing by the whole country. Nathan pulled a shoebox of handwritten drafts from under the porch bench and said quietly, "CJ was my sister, Claire June. She died 11 years ago. The book started as letters to her. Putting my face on them always felt like selling her." Then he looked at me the way you look at someone when you're handing them something breakable. I said, "Okay. That's all. Okay." And I kept that promise through everything you're about to hear, through every insult at every dinner. I kept it even when it cost me my own mother. We announced our engagement at my parents' dining table on a Sunday, under the good chandelier, which in the Lewis house is a courtroom fixture. My mother looked at the ring, then at Nathan, and asked the question she'd been holding since the day she learned his name. "What is it you do, exactly, Nathan?" And my husband-to-be, who has sat across from national editors and turned them down politely, said with total peace, "I shelve books, mostly. Morning shift." You could hear the furnace tick. My mother's smile stayed up the way scaffolding stays up, and she said, "How restful," which in her language is a declaration of war. By Tuesday, she had searched him every way a 61-year-old woman with a library card and a prayer chain can search a man. She found nothing. No property in his name but a used pickup. No title, no LinkedIn, no family money. His parents were gone, and the only relative anyone remembered was a sister who'd died young. My mother delivered the verdict to me over the phone while I graded spelling tests. "You're marrying a bag boy with a hobby, Emma." I remember exactly where each red checkmark stopped on the page. Here's what took me years to understand, and I'll give it to you now for free. She wasn't objecting to Nathan. She'd have taken a cruel man with a good title in a heartbeat. She'd done it before, socially speaking, at every fundraiser for decades. What she couldn't survive was a son-in-law with nothing to announce, a blank space where the coffee hour paragraph should be. My father said almost nothing that whole dinner, which was its own kind of sentence. And me? I sat there holding a secret the size of a national bestseller list, and I smiled, because people were looking. Old habits have excellent posture. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story where I made the choice that everything else grew out of, and I made it in silence, at my own kitchen table. I could have said one sentence. "Mom, he's C.J. Harlow." That's it. 14 years of her favorite morning show has featured those books. There's a Lanternfield poster in the children's wing of the county library she fundraised for. One sentence, and her contempt flips to worship before the kettle boils. I sat with that sentence for a long time one night, tea going cold, listening to Nathan's typewriter, an actual typewriter, ticking away upstairs like patient weather. And I put the sentence away. For 2 reasons, and I knew them both clearly, which is how I know this wasn't me being naive. The first was the promise. He'd handed me the one breakable thing he owned. You don't spend someone's trust to win an argument they're not even entitled to. The second reason was harder, and it's the real one. If I bought my mother's respect with his name, I'd be agreeing with her scale. I'd be saying, "You're right, Mom. A man is worth what can be announced about him." And here, look, mine announces beautifully. The same scale that had weighed me my whole life, smile, perform, present well, would just get a shinier weight on it. And someday, inevitably, it would be set on my children. So I chose the harder checkout line. I let my family believe I was marrying nobody, knowing they were wrong, knowing I could prove it, and declining to. If you've never done that, I can't fully describe the loneliness of it. My mother responded to my quiet the only way she knows how. She escalated to the venue. I wanted to be married in Dana Whitfield's apple orchard. Dana teaches art across the hall from me. Her family's orchard sits on the north edge of town, and in mid-May it snows petals sideways when the wind comes off the hill. 45 guests. Her husband Ben, who films weddings as a side gig, would run the camera. Folding chairs, pie instead of cake, my students' watercolor place cards. I had never been so sure of a plan in my life. My mother heard orchard and reacted the way other people react to the word audit. Her counteroffer arrived within the week. Fully built, like she'd had it warehoused since my birth. Ceremony at St. Andrews. Reception at the Elks Lodge. 200 guests minimum. The county paper photographer who owed her a favor, and a receiving line, so that the whole town could inspect the merchandise. A wedding in a field, Emma, she said, drawing the word field out like something you'd scrape off a boot. Like a livestock auction. I said the orchard wasn't negotiable. She regrouped, and what came next was not shouting. My mother doesn't shout. Volume is for people without leverage. She lowered her voice into its silk register and said, "Change the venue, sweetheart, or don't blame your father and me for what people will say. We won't be able to protect you from it." Notice the architecture of that sentence. The threat wears a nurse's uniform. The judgment is always somebody else's. People. The great invisible jury she's served her entire life, and she's just the poor bailiff. I held the orchard. She marked her calendar. And her RSVP card came back with the box checked yes and a note in her looping hand that I have kept to this day. We'll see how far you take this. The 6 weeks before the wedding, my mother ran a quiet referendum on my marriage through every kitchen in Maple Falls. My Aunt Carol Ann called to ask gently whether I was sure about this bookstore person. Because Patricia was just so worried, and had I considered how it looked, a teacher marrying a man who... Her voice dropped to the register reserved for tumors, shelves. My cousin texted me a real estate listing for a condo 2 towns over, captioned, "In case you need a fresh start, LOL." The women's circle developed a sudden fascination with long engagements. None of it was traceable. That's the genius of my mother's method. She never says the cruel thing herself. She just seeds the weather and lets the town rain on you. Through all of it, Nathan stayed level. He fixed the school's ancient laminator because I mentioned it squeaked. He learned my students' names off the watercolor place cards and asked about the shy one every night. Once, only once, I cracked and asked him whether it bothered him. Being called a bag boy with a hobby by people who'd read his books aloud to their grandchildren without knowing it. He thought about it the way he thinks about everything, fully. And then he said, "They're reviewing the cover, Em. Everybody reviews the cover. You read the book." I wrote that down on a sticky note the same night, and it lived on my desk at school for months. So we sailed for the orchard. 45 chairs, pie ordered, petals loading in the trees like confetti waiting for a verdict. Before I take you to that morning, let me ask you something. Reader to reader. Have you ever kept someone's secret while your whole family judged them out loud, held the one sentence that would have ended it, and refused to spend it? If you have, tell me in the comments how long you lasted. I read every single one. And subscribe, because everything you've heard so far is just the table being set. In 3 weeks' time, my mother is going to find out who she walked out on, live, on national television, on the show she's watched for 20 years. But first, she has to walk out. May 16th came in soft and bright, and the orchard did the thing orchards do once a year for about 9 days. It snowed upward. Petals everywhere, catching in hair, drifting across the folding chairs like the trees had opinions and all of them were yes. Dana ran the morning with a clipboard and an art teacher's eye, rearranging pie tables by color story. Ben mounted his camera on a tripod by the 3rd row and clipped a small microphone to the arch post. Remember that microphone. It has a part to play. My students' watercolor place cards fluttered on the long tables. 45 people we loved were finding their seats. And at 11:40, my parents' sedan came up the orchard lane, and my mother stepped out dressed as if for a deposition. Steel gray suit, good pearls, the handbag that only comes out when someone needs to be reminded of standards. My father wore the tie she chooses for him. They took their front row seats the way diplomats take seats at a summit in a country they don't recognize. During family photos, my mother placed herself, angled her good side, and when I, a bride, at my own wedding, in my grandmother's altered lace, let my face rest for one unguarded second, she leaned in close, fixed a strand of my hair without asking, and said it. Smile, Emma, people are looking. 28 years since the church steps, word for word. The photographer counted 3. The shutter clicked. If you find that photo now, you'll see a bride smiling like a professional, which is what I was. Trained from 6. Best in my field, working my last shift. The processional music started. Dana squeezed my hand at the top of the rows, and I want the record to show. Even then, even after everything, I looked at those 2 front row chairs and thought, they came. Maybe that's enough. I walked myself between the chairs. My father hadn't offered. I'd stopped waiting for him to volunteer for things my mother hadn't approved in advance. And honestly, walking alone through falling petals toward Nathan Cole felt less like a lack and more like an accurate biography. He stood by the arch in a navy suit, no pocket square, because he'd given it to a nervous ring bearer who wanted to look fancy. That's the man. Pastor Reyes, who has known me since Sunday school, opened warm and easy, told the story of the 9-year-old at the bookstore without knowing half of what he was saying, and the orchard laughed in the right places. I held Nathan's hands. Petals landed on our shoulders like the trees were signing the license as witnesses. And through it all, in the corner of my eye, I could see my mother conducting her private arithmetic, scanning the rows and counting who wasn't there. No superintendent, no Rotary president, no county paper photographer to fix the day into the official record. 45 faces, and to her, not one of them counted as people. Her gaze moved over my students' watercolor cards, over the pie table, over Ben's tripod, and her mouth did the small tightening it does when a thing has been measured and found. Her word. Always hers. Embarrassing. I knew that mouth. I'd been managing that mouth my whole life. I turned my eyes back to my husband, because Pastor Reyes had arrived at the part we'd written ourselves. Emma and Nathan have prepared their own vows, he said, and smiled at us. And the orchard went quiet the way a classroom goes quiet when the good part of the read-aloud is coming. In that quiet, clear as a bell being stolen, I heard a wooden chair leg shriek against the ground behind me. My mother stood up in the middle of my wedding. She rose the way she rises at the end of a disappointing school concert. Unhurried, gloves gathered, a woman with somewhere better to be. 45 heads turned. Pastor Reyes stopped with his mouth open on my name. And my mother smoothed the front of her deposition suit, looked not at me but slightly above the crowd, at her invisible jury, and said, at a volume engineered to reach exactly 3 rows and carry to all of them, "This is embarrassing." Then she picked up her handbag, took my father by the sleeve, and walked out of my wedding. I want you to hear the specific sounds, because I will hear them for the rest of my life. The second chair scraping. My father's. Softer. Apologetic even in furniture. Petals shushing under her heels going down the aisle that wasn't an aisle. A robin somewhere going about its business. And 45 people not breathing. My father looked back once at the lane's bend. He didn't stop. Just looked back. File that away. We'll come back for it. And here is where my old life ended, not when she stood up, but 2 seconds after, when every face swung from her exit to me, waiting to see which Emma would answer. The manager, who would laugh it off, smooth it over, save the day for the family brand. Or the bride. I felt the manager reach for the door. I did. I felt the old sentence assembling. She's not been well. We'll laugh about this. And I looked at Pastor Reyes, and I heard my own voice come out level and certain and finished. Keep going. He looked at me. I nodded once, and I said my vows in my grandmother's lace, in falling petals, to the finest man I have ever known, out loud, complete, once, the way vows are said, in front of 2 empty chairs in the front row. Nathan's vows had a line in them about a lantern in a field that only I fully understood. I'll keep that one. Some things you don't perform. By Monday, Maple Falls had a version of my wedding, and it wasn't mine. It had gone out through the casserole network before the leftover pie was wrapped, Emma Lewis sprang a marriage on her poor parents. Nobody even knows this man. Patricia was blindsided. You know she found out he doesn't even have a profile anywhere? She had no choice but to leave. Staying would have endorsed it. I heard my own wedding retold at the pharmacy by a woman who didn't see my face in time. In her version, my mother's exit was reluctant, dignified, almost protective. The word hasty appeared. The phrase that poor family appeared. The casseroles stopped arriving at my parents' house is what should have happened next, if the town ran on justice. Instead, they stopped arriving at mine. Metaphorically speaking, since what actually stopped was warmth. A couple of parents at pickup found reasons to talk to the other third-grade teacher. The women's circle sent a card congratulating me on my elopement, which took real craftsmanship, considering there'd been invitations. Dana ran interference like a linebacker in a cardigan, cornering gossips by the copier with her bright, terrifying smile. And I got through it the way I've gotten through everything since I was 6. I went to work. I taught fractions. I pinned 25 crayon self-portraits to a corkboard. On the Friday after the wedding, a girl in my class handed me a folded paper that said Mrs. Cole in purple marker with a crown on the O, and I made it all the way to the parking lot before I cried. The good kind, mostly, the kind that comes when a new name fits better than the old one did. That weekend, Ben called. The wedding video was ready. He asked, careful as a man diffusing something whether I wanted it, and I quote him, as it happened, or tidied up. If you remember one object from this story, make it this one. A small silver USB drive with my wedding on it, complete and uncut. Ben had captured everything. The arch mic and the tripod saw it all. The petals, the vows, and the middle, a chair shrieking, a gray suit rising. This is embarrassing, in beautiful audio. My father's sleeve, 45 held breaths, and a bride saying, keep going. Ben's offer was gentle. He could trim the interruption, splice the day into the version where nothing happened. Plenty of couples would take that cut, and I'd judge none of them. I sat with the drive in my palm. It weighed nothing. It weighed everything. While word came down the family wire, through Aunt Carol Ann, that my mother wanted that footage handled. Tell the videographer to cut that part, sweetheart, before it gets around. No reason to keep an ugly misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. 26 days of planning her exit line, and now the record needed correcting. And I realized I was holding the exact job I'd been raised for. Family archivist, keeper of the tellable version. Everything in me that was trained at 6 years old reached for the scissors, and then set them down. I told Ben, the tape stays whole. Not to post it, never that. I've never shown that footage to a soul, and by the end of this story you'll understand why that mattered. Not to destroy it either, just whole. What happened, kept in one piece, whether or not it flattered anyone. It was the first time in my life I'd refused to edit my family, and my hands shook like I'd quit smoking. I put the drive in the chalk box on my classroom desk, under the stubs of blue and yellow. The safest place I know, guarded by 25 8-year-olds and the smell of construction paper. It sat there quietly, being true, while everything above ground got louder. 2 weeks after the wedding, my mother came to my classroom after dismissal. Neutral ground, her choice, which should have told me something. She sat in the reading corner in her good coat, on a child's chair, spine straight as a flagpole, and for the first time in my 34 years, she opened the locked room. Her father, my grandfather, Quarry Street. She told it flat, eyes on the alphabet rug, how he'd be found sleeping it off in the doorway of Hutchins Pharmacy on Saturday nights, and how the town would arrange to walk past him slowly on Sunday mornings, in their church clothes, to get a good long look. How her mother would send her, Patricia, 10 years old, out at dawn with a bucket to scrub the porch and set the milk bottles straight, so that by the time the neighbors passed, there was something orderly to see. I learned to get ahead of every eye in this town before it landed, she said. You think I'm cruel. I was 10, Emma. Shame is a debt. Somebody in this family has always paid it. I paid it so you wouldn't have to. And for about 30 seconds, in the little chair, she was not the chairwoman of anything. She was a girl on a porch with a bucket, and I could have crossed the rug and put my arms around her, and I almost did. Then she stood, smoothed her coat, and became the committee again. Which is why I won't watch you hand this town a new debt. That man will make you the charity case of Maple Falls. Fix this while you still can. And on my desk, next to the chalk box, 6 inches from my uncut wedding, she set a cream business card. A lawyer. The kind affiliated with the diocese. The kind you call about an annulment. She let herself out through my classroom door, past 25 crayon self-portraits, without looking at a single one. Life at the cottage, meanwhile, was almost embarrassingly sweet. The true kind of sweet. The kind with no audience. Nathan wrote afternoons on the porch. I graded at the kitchen table. We argued about whether chowder counts as dinner. It does. And whose turn it was to fight the ancient doorbell. Nobody's. It stayed broken. Then, in the first week of June, the letters from New York got thicker. The Lantern Field had been optioned for film the year before. I'd known that. But now it was real. Greenlit. Cast. Dated. And with it came the thing Nathan had held off for 9 years. The studio and the publisher, gently and then, less gently, wanted the author. One appearance. The reasoning, laid out in a phone call he took pacing the yard. The press had started digging on its own, and a name this big doesn't stay sealed once money that size moves around it. Somebody was going to find Claire June Cole in an old obituary and do the math in public. Nathan came in from the yard, sat across from me, and put his hands flat on the table the way he does when something matters. If it's coming out either way, he said, I want to be the one who says her name first. On my terms. Once. He wasn't asking permission. We don't run our marriage that way. But he was asking me to decide it with him, because a private life is a 2-person canoe. We talked until midnight. About Claire, about my mother, about what happens to a quiet man when the country learns his face. And we agreed. One morning show. The biggest one, so he'd never have to do a second. He'd talk about his sister properly, before a tabloid could dig her up sideways. The booking came fast. Friday, June 6th, 7:40 a.m. The show my mother has watched for 20 years. I wasn't in my parents' living room that Friday, but my Aunt Carol Ann was, and she has told the story so many times, to so many kitchens, that I can run the footage in my head like I shot it myself. 7 a.m. Coffee can percolating, my mother in her spot with the good mug, the show she's watched for 20 years warming up through the local weather. My father with the sports page half lowered. 7:40. The host leans into the camera with the grin they save for sweeps week and says, our next guest has sold 40 million books, and until this morning, nobody in America knew his face. Please welcome, for the first time anywhere, the author of The Lantern Field, C.J. Harlow. And my husband walked out under the studio lights in his navy suit. The wedding suit. He wore the wedding suit. He never told me, and I found out watching the replay and had to sit down. And shook the host's hand, and gave the country the small level smile I married. My aunt says the percolator was the only thing that moved. My mother's mug stopped somewhere south of her chin. On screen, the host said, You've kept this secret 9 years. Who knew? And Nathan said, My wife. One short answer, delivered to roughly 8 million people, 3 weeks after my mother walked out of our vows. My aunt says, and I believe her, because Carol Ann embellishes everything except the things that matter, that my mother set the mug down without looking at it, and turned around slowly, all the way around, to face my father, and said nothing. The woman who has never once in her life been caught without a statement for the room had no statement for the room. Me? I was in the teacher's lounge with a paper cup of bad coffee, watching Dana scream silently into a dish towel, while our vice principal said, Wait. That's Nathan. From Fern and Feather. That's Nathan? My phone lit up on the table and began to move by itself, buzzing across the wood. It did not stop for 4 days. 14 missed calls from my mother before 9 a.m. I counted them at recess the way you'd count weather damage. Then the relatives, in order of rank. Aunt Carol Ann, twice. The cousin with the condo listing, whose new text read, OMG, we always loved him. The Women's Circle landline, which I didn't know could text. When I finally answered my mother that evening, her voice had changed operating systems entirely. Gone was the silk-wrapped threat. In its place, Something bright and brisk and terrifyingly warm, the voice she uses on the bishop. Sweetheart. Well, you could have told us. We were completely blindsided, you know that's all it ever was. If we'd known. And there it was. The sentence she'd have taken back if she'd heard herself. If we'd known. Do you understand what this does for this family? For this family. Not. I watched your husband tell 8 million people that his wife was the only one who knew, and I remembered what I said at your wedding. And something in me needs to be forgiven. No. The stock had gone up, and the shareholders were calling a meeting. I stood at my kitchen window watching Nathan wrestle the broken doorbell, a man who had been national news for 11 hours and had come home and put on work gloves, and I gave my mother the only true thing I had. You weren't blindsided, Mom. You were told everything that mattered. You were told I loved him. A pause on the line. Brief, professional, the sound of a strategy adjusting. Then, we'll talk about all of it soon. Don't make plans for the second Saturday of July. She hung up before I could ask what that meant. It means, I said to the window, that the committee is in session. I had no idea. What my mother built in the next 5 weeks, you have to almost admire. She rebuilt reality the way she does everything. Thoroughly. And in public. Within a week, Maple Falls had a new official history, and in this one, my mother had always sensed something special about Nathan. You know Patricia, went the new gospel at coffee hour. She keeps things close. But she knew. A mother knows. The walkout? A scheduling misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by people who love drama. She reserved the Elks Lodge, the very hall I'd refused for the wedding, for the second Saturday in July. 200 invitations went out on cream cardstock, a celebration honoring Mr. and Mrs. Nathan Cole, and under it, in letters twice the size of our names, the author C.J. Harlow, join us in welcoming him to the family. She booked the county paper photographer who owed her the favor. Somebody's nephew whose strings for a Boston station made noises about a camera crew. It was, I have to be honest, a masterpiece. She'd taken the worst public relations disaster of her life and reframed it, in under a month, as her own coronation. And then came the third run at the anchor. Aunt Carol Ann, deployed casually at the pharmacy. Oh, Patricia mentioned there's a lovely video of the wedding. She'd love a copy for the party montage. Just the nice parts, obviously. That awkward little moment, well, no need for that in there, honey. Snip, snip. Snip, snip. There it was again. The family scissors. Offered handle first, the job I was born into. Edit the record, curate the version, make us look right. Twice I'd refused quietly. This time I said it in words Carol Ann could carry back whole. The tape stays as it happened. Tell Mom the montage can survive the truth, or it can go without me. The pharmacy went very quiet. Somewhere across town, I like to think, a chalk box rattled. My father came to the cottage alone on a Tuesday evening, which for Gerald Lewis is an act of espionage. He stood at the garden gate holding his old metal toolbox like a passport, and he didn't come in. My father has never once in my life initiated an indoor conversation. So we stood in the yard in the long June light. He looked at everything except me, the gutters, the porch rail, the dead doorbell. Then he said, "You know I heard them. Your vows." I didn't understand. He set the toolbox down and finally looked at me. And my father is not a man built for what his face was doing. Wedding day. Your mother was in the car with the engine on. I told her I forgot my hat. He half laughed at himself. I've never owned a hat. I went back up the lane and stood behind the fence line, there where the lilacs come over, and I heard the whole thing. Both of you. That part he said about the lantern. He cleared his throat. I've spent 40 years standing on the wrong side of things, Emmy. The fence was just the one time I could see myself doing it. I did not cry, because if I started, I wasn't sure which decade I'd be crying about. I asked him why he never came back around the fence. He picked up the toolbox, already retreating into himself, and said the truest thing anyone in my family has ever said. Your mother needed somebody in that car. Somebody always has. Then, because Lewis's can't end on an open heart, your doorbell's broken. I'll come by Saturday. He fixed it that weekend. First try, 20 minutes. A man who is only fluent in one language, saying something enormous in it. He also RSVP'd yes to my mother's party, because of course he did. Somebody always has to be in that car. Then the producers called back, and the temptation arrived gift-wrapped. The segment had done numbers apparently, the kind that get follow-ups commissioned. The pitch, relayed in a chipper voicemail, the family behind C.J. Harlow. A camera crew in Maple Falls. The bookstore. The cottage. The orchard. And, quote, the folks. Parents at a kitchen table. A hometown. The whole warm loaf. Nathan listened to the voicemail twice and handed me the phone, and here is the exact shape of what sat in my hand. My mother had spent 5 weeks constructing her redemption, but national television, the actual show, the one from her actual living room, that was the cathedral. And I controlled the door. One call and she's in the segment, immortalized at her own kitchen table as the mother who always knew. One different call, one quiet, factual conversation with a producer about what happened at the vows, with an uncut tape in existence. And she is finished in this town in a way no committee could ever repair. I want to be honest with you, because this story is worthless if I'm not. I sat with that second option longer than I'll ever admit to Nathan. For one night, I understood my mother completely. Understood what it is to hold the town's eyes in your hand like a remote control. Power over the audience doesn't feel like anger. It feels like a script waiting for a director, and everyone I'd ever known was already seated. That's the inheritance, right there. That's what Quarry Street built. I found out that week that Patricia had somehow gotten the producer's email. Small towns. And for the first time in my life, my mother asked me for something without wrapping it in a threat. Voicemail. Almost shy. One call, Emma. Let me sit in that segment. After everything. One call. After everything. Her words, not mine. Dana found me on a Friday after dismissal, sitting in my classroom in the reading corner, in the same little chair my mother had occupied, holding the producer's number in one hand and the chalk box in the other like a woman weighing 2 religions. She sat down across from me on the alphabet rug, cross-legged, art teacher to the last, and she didn't lecture. She asked one question, the kind that opens with a scalpel. What do you actually want, Em? Them back? Or the version of you that never needed them? I started to answer fast and she held up a paint-stained finger. Think. So I thought, right there among the crayon self-portraits. I thought about the want I'd carried down that orchard aisle. My parents in the front row, watching me say the truest words of my life. That want was dead. Not wounded. Dead. It died with a chair shriek on May 16th, and no lodge hall could resurrect it, because you cannot reattend what you walked out of. Vows only happen once. What was being offered now was a different product with the same packaging, a role in the new show. Beloved daughter of the visionary mother, smiling, people looking, and the segment, my beautiful poisonous second option, was just the same job with a bigger set. Managing the family image, one last time, with network lighting. Either door, I realized, led backstage. I looked up at Dana and heard myself say it plainly. I want to stop auditioning for people who left before the vows. Dana nodded slowly, then reached over and took the producer's number out of my hand, folded it in half, and said, Then let's talk about what you're wearing to your mother's party. Because I was going. Oh, I was absolutely going. Some things you have to return in person. The Elks Lodge, second Saturday of July, looked like the inside of my mother's mind. Flowers in regulation rows, 200 name cards in calligraphy, the county paper photographer patrolling with his flash, and over the head table, spanning the width of the stage, a banner. Welcome to the family, C.J. Harlow. Gold letters, taller than my husband. His pen name, his dead sister's initials. Rented out for the evening as my mother's marquee. Nathan read it from the doorway and said, very quietly, in the voice he almost never uses, She put Claire's name on a banner. Then he took my hand and we went in anyway, because I had promised my mother we would come, and I keep my promises. It's the family's best habit, and I got it from watching her keep the worst ones. The room turned toward us like a tide, and I want you to see the detail I will never forget. Down front, at the head table, 2 chairs of honor. Front row, center. Wrapped in ribbon, with our names on cardstock in my mother's looping hand. front row chairs, held for us, before the words are said. She had rebuilt my wedding at scale, with the seating corrected and herself in the bride's role, and I don't think she ever once saw the shape of it. My mother crossed the room in champagne silk, arms wide, and embraced me for the photographer, angled, professional, her cheek cool against mine, and whispered through her smile, "Everyone came. Everyone. The superintendent, the Rotary president, both priests. Every person whose absence she'd counted in the orchard was here in a folding chair, and so the arithmetic that made my wedding embarrassing now made this hall holy. The string lights came up. The nephew's news camera blinked red, and the master of ceremonies, Rotary, thrilled, tapped his glass and announced that before dinner, the family would like to make a toast. What came before the toast was a tour. My mother walked me through that crowd the way you walk a prize animal through a county fair, hand light on my back, steering, presenting. You remember Emma? Well, you know Emma now. Laughter everywhere, warm as a heat lamp and about as deep. I heard the new history recited back to me by people I'd known my whole life. We always said he was special. Your mother never doubted. What a story. What a family. The walkout had been fully dissolved. I watched a woman who had been sitting in the third row of my wedding. I'd watched her watch my mother leave. Tell me, glowing, that she was so glad everything worked out the way Patricia planned. Nathan absorbed it all with his level smile, deflecting book questions gently toward the library fund, keeping Claire's name out of hands that would smudge it. At the head table, my mother arranged us for the photographer. Her between Nathan and me, my father at the end, holding the room's happiness like a coat someone had handed him. The MC tapped the glass. The room hushed and turned. My mother rose, radiant, note cards in hand. She had note cards. And as the applause crested, she leaned down to me, close, perfume and champagne silk, and gave me, one last time, the sentence I was raised on, the sentence from the church steps and the orchard. Our family's entire constitution in a single breath, hissed sweetly through a hostess smile. Smile, Emma, people are looking. And something in me went perfectly, beautifully still. 28 years. And she'd said it once too often, in the one room where every single piece of my life was finally standing in the same place. The banner, the chairs, the town, the truth in a chalk box 3 miles away, and a woman about to give a toast at the wedding she walked out of. I stood up. I didn't take the microphone. I want that on the record. The mic was right there. The room was mine for the taking. 200 witnesses and a news camera. And every version of revenge I'd rehearsed at 3 a.m. lived in that microphone, and I left it in its stand. I simply stood, touched my mother's wrist. She was mid-rise, note cards fanned, and said, "Mom, 1 minute," behind the banner. She came because the photographer was watching, and a good hostess doesn't scene. And there, in the narrow dark between gold letters and cinder block, 1 square meter of truth in a hall built of performance, I finally gave my mother the conversation she'd been managing around for 3 decades. Quietly, evenly. A teacher's voice, the one that doesn't need volume because it isn't asking. I told her I knew what tonight was. I told her it was beautiful work, and I meant it. I told her what it cost. You didn't invite Emma tonight, Mom. You booked CJ Harlow. And you dressed my wedding up in a hall you chose, with the guest list you wanted, so you could stand where I stood and get it right this time. Her chin came up. Everything I have ever done, she began, silk voice, jury voice, and I watched her reach for the room behind her like a plug for a socket. And I said it, the sentence I'd been carrying since a chair shrieked in an orchard, the only sentence in my life I have ever aimed. You left before the vows. I'm leaving before the toast. Silence, back there behind the banner. Her mouth opened, and for 1 second, I swear it, the girl from Quarry Street looked out at me, 10 years old with a bucket, and I did not enjoy it. And that's how I knew I was doing this clean. I said the last part gently, because it was the true door, and I wanted it left open. When you want a daughter instead of a segment, the garden gate's unlocked. It's the cottage with the doorbell Dad fixed. Then I stepped back into the light. Nathan was already standing. He'd known from across the room, the way he always knows. My mother emerged behind me, smile bolted back on, one beat too late, and to her last hissed, "Emma, people are looking," delivered like a rosary through her teeth. I finally gave the answer 28 years overdue. Let them look. We walked the length of that hall slowly, hand in hand, unhurried, nodding to people we loved, through 200 guests, past the ribboned chairs, under her banner, out the double doors, into the July dark. Behind us, I heard it, a single champagne glass, set down, untouched. We didn't go home. Nathan drove us to the north edge of town, to Dana's orchard, without either of us saying it out loud. Some places are load-bearing. The chairs from the wedding were long stacked in the barn, but we hauled two out under the trees, right where the arch had stood, and Nathan brought the laptop from the truck. And in the dark, with July bugs conducting, we finally watched the wedding video. All of it. Uncut. I had kept that drive whole for 8 weeks, without once pressing play. We watched the petals. We watched me walk myself down between the chairs and decided, on review, that I had excellent posture for a woman being publicly orphaned. We watched the chair scrape. I gripped his hand. It still went through me like a dentist's drill. And we watched a gray suit rise and heard the sentence, "Clean and forever," in beautiful audio. "This is embarrassing." And then we watched a bride look at a pastor and say, "Keep going." And I heard my own vows for the first time from the outside, and I heard Nathan's, the lantern line, Claire's line. And the trees behind us dropped a few late petals on the actual chairs we were actually sitting in, which was either coincidence or applause. When it ended, Nathan was quiet a while. Then he said, "You know why I never cut Claire out of the books? Even the chapters where she's dying, even the ones readers write to me begging about?" I waited. "Because the vows only mean what they cost. Cut the cost out and it's just a speech." He closed the laptop. "You kept the tape whole, Em. You kept us whole." 2 chairs under the apple trees, occupied this time. The front row, it turns out, was never a location. It was a decision. And somebody finally sat in it. It's October now, and I owe you the honest ledger, because these stories usually end with a courtroom or a collapse, and real-life files, different paperwork. Nobody was destroyed. The town did not rise up against my mother. Towns never do. She is still chairwoman of the Harvest Festival, and her version of that July night, poor Emma, overwhelmed, you know how sensitive she's always been, circulates at coffee hour. And I let it. Her currency still spends everywhere in Maple Falls except one cottage with a working doorbell. The segment, "The Family Behind C.J. Harlow," never aired, because it was never filmed. Nathan did exactly what he promised the country. One appearance. Once. The tabloids sniffed around Maple Falls for a week, bought coffee, found a town full of people who genuinely didn't know anything, and left. The Claire June Cole Fund went public at the county library in September. There's a reading room now with her name over the door in small letters, the size Nathan chose. And on Saturdays, it is wall-to-wall kids, which is the only monument he ever wanted. My father comes to dinner every other Sunday, alone. He drives himself, which is its own small revolution, parks by the gate, rings the doorbell he fixed just to hear it work, and sits in our kitchen eating chowder. It counts as dinner. I've won that argument, talking to Nathan about gutters and, lately, about Claire, because my husband will talk about his sister now, at his own table, in his own name. My mother has not come. I didn't expect her to. Walls built over 60 years don't come down over one autumn. But in September an envelope arrived, addressed in the looping hand I'd know anywhere. Inside, the county paper's photo of Nathan and me at the film's first press day, neatly clipped, edges straight as always. And on the back, 3 words, no signature. "You looked lovely." That's not an apology. I've stopped translating her into what I need her to be. That was the old job. And I've retired. But I taped it inside my classroom cabinet next to the chalk box because a crack is not a bridge, and it is also not a wall. My class is reading The Lantern Field this month. Last week, a boy looked up from chapter 9 and said, "Whoever wrote this must be somebody's favorite person." I said, "He is." The garden gate, for the record, is still unlocked. Here's the whole thing in one line, and it took me 28 years and 2 walkouts to earn it. A family that lives for the audience will hand you a script instead of a hug. And you are allowed, at any age, in any room, to hand the script back. Being loved was never embarrassing. Pretending was. That's my story. 2 empty chairs, an uncut tape, a banner with a borrowed name on it. If the people who left you are only circling back now that you're worth announcing, you're allowed to meet them at the gate instead of on their stage. Tell me in the comments the moment you handed the script back. I read everyone. And subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge for more stories where the quiet ones finally walk at their own pace.